think a lot of them are just stone cold, there's no emotion, and they don't view people as people anymore. And you almost feel like you were literally living in the Twilight Zone, and you feel like you're the only sane one in a bunch of insane people. And it's up to the point where I'm afraid that I'm going to start thinking that this is normal. I don't want to ever get to that point.
It's July 2025. Now, what I'm about to talk about, I've talked about in other videos, and I'm going to be bringing it all together into this one video because it all ties in together. Now, I've talked about, for example, how professions draw from society and how people and professionals do not care what the truth is, rather what they want the truth to be. And sometimes this has to do with revenge or even agendas. Now, how does one prove that they're innocent when either no crime has been committed or they have absolutely nothing to do with the crime that was committed? How does one prove their innocence? Now, over the years, I've talked about, for example, people like Daniel Holtzclaw, a former Oklahoma police officer who was falsely accused and wrongfully convicted. I've also talked about Stephen Avery, who was wrongfully convicted and sentenced and served 18 years and was found not guilty, released, and then he was set up on these other charges. Now, before anyone gets into Stephen Avery saying, oh, but because a lot of people have been talking a lot of nonsense trying to break down that case, there's a gentleman by the name of Charles Edward Myers, also known as Ed Edwards, and he was a serial killer, and his MO was committing murders and pinning them on innocent people. And this all came about once he was actually caught and sentenced for some murders, where he admitted to all these things, including knowing information about the Stephen Avery case and the murder that was pinned on Stephen Avery. Now, some other details which support all that. For example, when Stephen Avery was going through his trial, this Ed Edwards was seen at the courthouse. There's actually accidental photos taken of him walking into the courthouse, and there's some other photos of him at different scenes. And one of Ed Edwards' homes was just down this road from Stephen Avery's place. So I just want to get that clear when it comes to the so-called controversy if Stephen Avery is actually innocent or not. Ed Edwards was the person who did it, and the so-called perceived authorities took advantage of that and pinned it on Stephen Avery. But I'll get to that in a moment. But before I really get into this, there's a plethora of people who are falsely accused or wrongfully convicted, and I'm sure there's even more that I don't even know about, none of us know about, because this type of things happens every day. And I'm gonna do a mention of John Ramsey's to show how even when the justice system overall has not initiated, for example, a false narrative, a false accusation, and a wrongful conviction, how someone from society, for example, a spouse in John Ramsey's case will falsely accuse someone and have an innocent man convicted and his life ruined. Now, when you look at, for example, when there's agendas or revenge or something by authority types, this really makes it next to impossible to even consider defeating, for example, because they have unlimited resources and society overall will support perceived authority, whatever they say. Now, when you look at the case of Stephen Avery, for example, how he was released after 18 years for a rape that he never committed, and he spent 2 years out of prison, and obviously he was going to sue the state and everything else because they knew that he was innocent of that, but they still convicted him. I think it was like a day or two prior to when the lawsuit was to begin, they pinned a murder charge on him. And it's a very sad story. There's actually a documentary about what's it called, Making of a Murderer, which is where I kind of got Making of a Criminal from, in case anyone was wondering. And they pinned it on him because that pretty much ended the lawsuit. And what little breadcrumbs he did get from that as a settlement got spent on doing his defense. Now, I also mentioned, for example, Daniel Holtzclaw, who, again, is a former Oklahoma police officer. And this really shows that no one is exempt from being falsely accused, wrongfully convicted, even those within the system, for whatever reason, and how the very system that he worked for turned on him, or at least some of them did, and now he's serving 360 some odd years in prison for things he never did. It doesn't really matter because they got what they wanted. So how does someone prove their innocence when no crime has been committed, or they have no knowledge, absolute no knowledge of a crime? How does one prove their innocence? And there was a story, for example, about, I forget the whole details, but somewhere in the United States, there was an individual, he was turning his life around, and there was a flood, and they have flood preventative measures like little dams along the river, and he had seen that it was leaking, so he tried to stop the leak, got help or something. But anyway, long story short, the water prevention system failed and flooded farms and the whole 9 yards. And what's interesting is the insurance companies for all the people in that town was not going to pay because apparently, if I'm not mistaken, acts of God wasn't covered, which would be like a flood or something. And they convicted this innocent man of sabotaging this dam so that they can collect insurance. The whole town, the whole county, the courts, everyone knew absolutely that he was innocent. But they wanted to collect their insurance money and had no problems convicting him to 25 years in prison. This is society. People don't care what the truth is, rather what they want the truth to be. And we see this on any topic, whether it be law, politics, religion, anything. People are the problem. And when people, for example, talk about, oh, government bad, police bad, all this other stuff, and I'm not stating anything about that, I'm just saying what people are saying, What people really need to look at is themselves as a society, as a group, perhaps even individually. Because we live in a world now where it's all about me, 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 and no one really cares about them, 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 them. And here we are. So what can you take from all this? Well, things are going to get much worse as the civilization decays, and it's going to decay faster and faster. We're going to see more injustice and perhaps even more tyranny when it comes to, for example, false narratives, false accusations, and wrongful convictions. And I'm just going to close off by using my story that took place in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, when I began talking about the sexual abuse, trafficking these vulnerable women, a non-profit mental health organization which the Alberta Health Services was funding 60% of, and how everything snowballed. I just thought, I'm going to say they were interviewing, I said what I knew, and that was that, and that got leaked, and that began my demise, and it just snowballed. I never set out to, I never even dreamt how things would turn out for me. It just snowballed. But what we see here is we have, for example, the two former police officers, Richard Kinnell and John Hayhurst, who went to the extreme and created such a mess, not just for myself, but for themselves and everyone else involved, that a big cover-up had to be done. And I had to be convicted, wrongfully convicted, of allegedly assaulting a police officer in obstruction, because that was their defense, and it was their defense for the lawsuit, for the injuries and everything else that I sustained. And this is the reality. For example, a lot of people face no one really cares about. And I see, for example, I'm going to bring it up again, how there are very guilty people, for example, these fake heroes of the so-called Convoy of Freedom, who everyone's supporting. These people are guilty. Again, not because they were protesting, because they committed crimes. Some of the crimes were very, very serious. Like they want to have shootouts or whatever. And people will support guilty people. And it just came to my mind where how these very same people will point the finger at, say, another story of a crime that was committed and someone's let out, for example, they make bail or something, and they're like, oh, look at this, you know, criminals are walking free, but they're supporting guilty people to walk free as well. The irony, because people don't care what the truth is, rather what they want the truth to be. But I really want you to think about, how does an innocent person prove their innocence when either no crime has been committed or they absolutely have no knowledge of a crime that was? And you can even apply that to, for example, how does a sane person prove that they are sane when there's an agenda? People only see what they want to see. Anyway, I think you kind of get the point where I'm going with all that. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.
Leslie Vass was 17 back in 1975, sentenced to 20 years for an armed robbery he did not commit. After 10 years, A witness says it was not Leslie who did the robbery. He set free and paid $250,000 for his trouble. Now, 21 years later, with 3 orders that his conviction be expunged from his record, it's still there.
And this person is starting to picture how it could have happened. And what could have been turns into what would have been, turns into what was.
So by the 3rd interview, the memory has taken hold. And it wasn't just this once. Shaw was able to convince over 70% of participants that they committed a crime.
I was incredibly surprised at the rates that I had in terms of successfully implanting these false memories.
False memory studies like this question one of the cornerstones of the criminal justice system.
In those hundreds of cases where DNA testing has proven that these individuals were wrongly convicted, about 3/4 of the time, the convictions were based on faulty eyewitness testimony.
Listen to this and write it down if you can't remember it. You're never going to outgrow warfare. You simply must learn to fight. I hear people saying to me, oh, when is it going to get easier? When you die.